Hey everybody, this video is called So Many Laws, and today we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of Deuteronomy, where we're going to look at Deuteronomy chapter 24, which is speaking on divorce, and there's many other laws. So the reason why I'm saying so many laws is because this week alone, in these last two videos and today, we're seeing many laws. Like, it's more than we can remember. But we're going to look at chapter 24, verse 1 starting out. It says, "When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, when she has departed from his house, and goes and becomes another man's wife, if the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her as a wife, then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she had been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance." So chapter 24 here, Moses is speaking on the matter of divorce. And it must be said before you further go into it that God does not command, God does not endorse, God does not condone, and God does not even suggest divorce. And it recognizes that divorce will happen among people, and it's permitted really only on restricted grounds. And divorce in the Hebrew, it comes from the word karithoth, which means pretty much to cut away. And divorce should be thought of as an amputation of that which is one flesh, because in Genesis 2:24 God says that the man will leave his parents and be joined with a wife, and they will become one flesh. So a divorce is really the cutting away of one flesh. And a divorce was to be sealed with a certificate of divorce. It wasn't just supposed to be something verbal where the guy's like, "I don't love you anymore and I'm taking off." It was something that was actually official. It was not a verbal statement. And uncleanness is a very interesting word, and throughout the decades and the centuries, the word's been abused by people trying to justify their actions. And the rabbis in the past, they defined it as anything in what the wife might do that displeases the husband. And that's not what uncleanness, I believe, is speaking about here. I don't believe that because your wife burns the bacon that's grounds for divorce. Or let's say, your wife gains weight or whatever, that's not grounds for divorce. And uncleanness in the Hebrew, erva, it speaks of nudity and disgrace and blemish and nakedness. And so Jesus further gives more details on what was the meaning of divorce here in Deuteronomy later on in the gospel according to Matthew. And divorce, according to verse 1, is not mandatory for uncleanness, but it's permitted if a husband lost all respect for adulterous reasons. And what a powerful law, that if a divorced woman married again, she could never return to her first husband. And we see that in some cases today where people will get a divorce and they'll end up remarrying later. And so she could never return to her first husband. And to break this law was to commit another abomination before the Lord, such as the abomination of homosexuality and the abomination of idolatry and all that. And we see that remarriage isn't permitted. And in verse 5 it says, it moves into other miscellaneous laws here. It says, "When a man has taken a new wife, he should not go out to war or be charged with any business. He shall be free at home 1 year and bring happiness to his wife whom he has taken. So we see that Moses spends very few minutes on the topic of divorce here, and then he moves into verse 5 here, stating that in the first year of marriage, a man had the responsibility to be unified with his wife. So he was to not be part of military service, and a man was not to devote that year outside of anything else, but to devote that year towards his marriage and the enjoyment and the establishment of the marriage. And it's crazy to look at today that the average honeymoon today is probably no longer than a weekend. And I haven't looked up like statistics on that, but it seems like when people get married today, it's usually like a 2 or 3 day getaway, if that. And you know, if you're lucky, maybe you're going away on a cruise for a couple weeks. But newlyweds in Israel, they were called to be intimate for that first year. And the husband was to bring happiness to his wife. And we see the purpose here. We see the phrase come to life here. A happy wife makes a happy life. And that's kind of what the Bible is pointing toward here with Moses, that when a man married, he was to devote himself that first year totally to his marriage. And so happy wife, happy life is kind of biblical in nature in Deuteronomy. In verse 6 here, it says, no man shall take the lower or the upper millstone in pledge, for he takes one's living in pledge. So 2 millstones were needed to grind grain, and neither was 2 to be taken in pledge, because it was indispensable to one's daily subsistence. And Israel was never to take advantage of each other in times of need, and non-essential items could be taken as a pledge. And a pledge could be taken, and there was not to be interest to be charged, but it was a guarantee of repayment of the loan. And never could a pledge take away a man's ability to provide for his family. In verse 7, it says, if a man is found kidnapping any of his brethren of the children of Israel, and mistreats him or sells him, then that kidnapper shall die, and he shall put away the evil from among you. So we see that kidnappers were held to a very strict law as well. There was the death penalty demanded for those who kidnapped a brother Israelite for involuntary servitude or as merchandise to sell. So, you know, for the African slave trade and, you know, the old American history behind slavery, in the Mosaic Law does not endorse that kind of slavery. Matter of fact, it says that those people who do stuff like that should be put to death. And you may recall that happening to Joseph in the Bible previously in Genesis chapter 37, verse 28. In verse 8 and 9, it says, take heed in an outbreak of leprosy that you carefully observe and do according to all that the priests, the Levites, shall teach you, just as I commanded them, so you shall be careful to do. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the way when you came out of Egypt. And Moses, he called for the people to follow the commands of the Lord regarding skin diseases, as spoken about back in Leviticus 13 and 14, as God wanted lepers examined and quarantined. In Israel, they were to take heed to prevent a pandemic. They were to take the necessary precautions to prevent a full-blown pandemic among them. And Moses, he reflects back to Numbers chapter 12, and you probably remember that passage where Miriam rebelled against Moses with the brother Aaron. And then Miriam, as a result, was struck with leprosy by God. And verse 10 through 13, when you lend your brother anything, you shall not go into his house to get his pledge, you shall stand outside, and the man to whom you lend shall bring the pledge out to you. And if the man is poor, you shall not keep his pledge overnight. You shall in any case return the pledge to him again when the sun goes down, that he may sleep in his own garment and bless you. And it shall be righteousness to you before the Lord your God. So the pledge was often something that would be along the lines of a cloak or another garment that would be given as a pledge to guarantee the repayment of a loan. And God's people were to act righteously when it came to lending money. It was not to be forcefully exact payment. And who allowed a poor person to retain his pledge overnight if it was necessary to keep him warm? So we see that even the less fortunate, when they were going to borrow, and they were to make a pledge that they were going to pay it back, that it couldn't affect their health and safety. And lending to the poor was to be interest-free, as we spoke about back in the last chapter in verses 19 and 20. And it was to be free of coercion to repay, and offered an extension of the loan beyond the sabbatical year, as back in Deuteronomy 15 verse 1 and 2 guaranteed. And the prophet Amos, he later went on to rebuke Israel in Amos chapter 8 for breaking this law regarding pledges. In verse 14-15, you shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy, whether one of your brethren, or one of the aliens who is in your land within your gates. Each day you shall give him his wages, and not let the sun go down on it, for he is poor, and he has set his heart on it, lest he cry out against you to the Lord, and it be sin to you. So day laborers were to be paid on the day that they labored, because they lived day to day on such wages, such as spoken about back in Leviticus chapter 19 verse 13, that states, and God commanded employers to treat their employees fairly and kindly. And God hears the cries of the oppressed, and they can know that God hears the cries of the oppressed, even if it doesn't feel like he does. So, for employers that don't want to treat your employees well, might want to take heed. In verse 16, it says, fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their fathers. A person shall be put to death for his own sin. So another law was punishment for a crime was to be borne only on the offender, not those that were relatives of the offender. So a son who was going to be put to death, it should not affect the parents, such as if a parent's committed a crime, the children should not be punished for it. In the exception of this verse of national proportion grounded in God's sovereign wisdom was the death later of Saul's 7 grandsons in 2 Samuel chapter 21 verse 5 through 9, and Bathsheba's and David's son back in 2 Samuel chapter 12 verse 14. But God also commanded that the whole family of Achan, later in Joshua chapter 7, verse 16 through 26, they were to be punished. But that was due to some conspiracy that was between the family members. So there was more than one person part of the crime. In verse 17-18, you shall not pervert justice due to the stranger or the fatherless, nor take a widow's garment as a pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this thing. So the administration of the law should be carried out with equity for all members of society. And that included those who would have the least power and the least influence, such as the widows and the orphans and immigrants. In Israel, they had to remember how much God had done for them. Then they would be able to be compassionate and fair and demonstrating and down with others. In verse 19 through 22, when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not glean it afterward. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this thing. So the practice of allowing the needy to glean in the field was grounded back in the remembrance of Israel's hard service of Egypt. And so to wrap up here, we see that Moses, he dwells further and revisits on the topic of divorce in ancient Israel. And I want to look at what Jesus had to say about it later, as I mentioned earlier, in Matthew chapter 19. So Matthew 19, verse 4 through 8, it says here, and he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no man separate. They said to him, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? He said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. So Jesus says on why God has permitted divorce, and it's because man's hearts are hardened. And so God knew that our hearts are desperately wicked and depraved, that we're not going to always have that forgiveness and reconciliation and marital issues. But there's standards that should rule if someone is going to follow in the footsteps of divorce. And just because a spouse commits sexual immorality, if they're repentant, there should be reconciliation before you even think of the divorce route. And if the offended spouse didn't have a hardened heart, they would forgive even after they were cheated on. And we see stories like that today throughout that, there's stories of marriages that were rocky and there was adultery involved and there was reconciliation after, many weeks and months. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, I want to look at what the Apostle Paul added on a reason why a divorce may occur in the Bible. And so 1 Corinthians 7:15, it says, if an unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. And so with 1 Corinthians 7:15, another permitted reason for a divorce would be an abandonment by an unbelieving spouse. That unbelieving spouse is not to be held to the standard because they're already lost. And Moses, he spoke on the law of remarriage in ancient Israel. And Moses spoke about the law of honor in marriage. And we see as he leaves, verse 4, he goes into many different miscellaneous laws as he taught to not take someone's livelihood as a pledge. And it should encourage us to seek a profit from the poverty, or it should encourage us to not seek a profit from the poverty or difficulty of others, that we ought to be compassionate and fair with those who are in worse situations than we are. And Moses, he talked about the punishment of kidnapping, that kidnapping wasn't just some probationary type issue or a couple years in prison. Kidnappers who treated other human beings immorally were called to face the death penalty, to be put to death. And Moses gave the command to act swiftly when leprosy breaks out. When it came to a public health crisis, they were to take the steps necessary to protect the people. And Moses spoke on handling a pledge rightly, and he gave the command to pay your workers. In James 5:4, it warned the rich man who oppresses his workers. And likewise, businesses or owners, bosses, they should not be using and abusing their people. They should be making sure that their people are being taken care of. And, that's part of what good managers or good leaders look like. Good managers and leaders, you don't look at somebody as just another body filling a spot making you profit. You should actually care about that person. You should care about, what might be things that are going to affect their work and all that. And you should be trying to encourage them and motivate them to be the best workers they ought to be. And so Moses said each one should also bear his own sin. And Moses called for compassion and fairness among Israel. And when we wonder why we should show compassion and fairness to others, we ought to remember where God has brought us from. Excuse me. We ought to remember where God has brought us from, what God has done for us, and what God continues to do day by day for us. And that's a reason for us to be compassionate and fair to other people, including those who oppose us. And Moses, he wrapped up with reflecting, leaving behind some of the harvest for the poor. So that's going to wrap up this video. I know that this week wasn't really, and videos isn't anything relevant with the current holidays or, with Passover, but, we're just going through the book of Deuteronomy, and, you'll hear Easter messages, Resurrection Sunday messages tomorrow when you go to church, but I felt to stay in Deuteronomy focused on that. So I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. If you observe the Passover or Easter, Resurrection Sunday, I hope that you enjoy it. Remember what Christ has done for us, that Christ, who was sinless, who was perfect, became our sin, and he died, shedding his blood to bring the forgiveness of our sins, to make us right with God. So take time to reflect, the gospel message this week. And I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. God bless.